In this lecture, we'll go over something called pivot points, which are just points in space that can be used as a reference point for transformations. We're going to be working with this pivot point menu up here. You can also access a pie menu version of this by pressing the period key. And these options work in other modes as well, such as edit mode. So here's what using pivot points looks like. If I set this to 3D cursor, for example, I place the cursor over there and I press R to rotate. It's using the 3D cursor as the pivot point for rotation. And it also works for scaling as well. Alright, so let me reset this back to the default median point right now. And let's go through what each one of these things does. Actually, first let me go up into this menu and I'll enable the movement object gizmo. And that's going to allow us to actually visualize where exactly the pivot point is. So we have the pivot point set to median point, which can be thought of as the center of gravity. And let me delete these real quick. So let's say I duplicated this cube a bunch of times down here, and maybe once or twice up there. Now if I select all the cubes, you can see that the median point is not in the center of the entire selection, which would be around right here. It instead is down closer to this swarm of cubes. Because there are more origin points down here, the pivot point is down towards them, and it's all based on origin points as well, so it has nothing to do with mesh sizes. And if you were in edit mode, then the number of vertices would be what's taken into account. For example, if I go into edit mode of one of these, and let's say I duplicated a bunch, so there's a lot of vertices up there, only a few down there, and I select everything, you can see that the median point is closer to this collection of vertices up there. All right, let me undo that. And another thing I want to mention is that when you have median point as the pivot point, if you only have one object selected, then the object's origin point becomes the pivot point. Now let's move on to bounding box center. Now, this is the one you want to use if you want to find the actual center of your selection. So let me enable that, and I'll select all the cubes again. And now you can see that the pivot point is in the center of the entire selection. Now, what bounding box does is it basically draws a box around your entire selection, and then it finds the center of the box and it places the pivot point right there. So now transformations are going to be based on that point in the middle of the selection. And this option is actually much more intuitive in my opinion, which is why this is usually my default pivot point. Now let's switch over to 3D cursor, which I demonstrated at the beginning of the lecture and in different lectures. Wherever the 3D cursor is becomes the pivot point. And again, you can move the 3D cursor by holding Shift and right-clicking. And anywhere you place it becomes the transformation center. Now let's switch over to individual origins. In object mode, this will make every object's own origin point the pivot point. So if we select all these objects and we press R to rotate, you'll see they're all rotating in place based on wherever their origin points are. And if we tab into edit mode, it actually works pretty much the same in here. If we select all of the vertices, then every individual mesh is going to rotate around its own center. And next up we have active element, and this option just makes the active selection the center point no matter how many other things are selected. So for example, this cube is highlighted a lighter orange, which means it's the active selection. So when we press R to rotate, it's going to rotate around that cube's origin point. If we hold Shift, left click on this one, it makes this the active selection, and now everything rotates around that object's origin point. And this works in edit mode as well. If we go into edit mode of this cube, hold Shift and left click on that vertex a couple times, it makes it the active selection, and now we can rotate around that point. So that option is actually a very handy pivot point to keep in mind. And alright, that's actually going to do it for this lecture then, so I'll see you in the next one.